Portlock was cursed and Bigfoot's place and nobody goes there.
On the southern edge of Alaska's Kenai Peninsula sits a ghost town. This in itself is not all that remarkable, but the frontiers of the American West are all pockmarked by similar failed settlements, and Alaska has more than its fair share, reciting it does on the margins of modern industrialized society. Now, countless generations have sought fortune and fame in these very remote regions, and when the dream dies, well, so do the towns. Now, sometimes it is not the dreams that die, but the residents. Either that or they're forced to flee to safety. Now, this is apparently what happened in the tiny town of Portlock, where once sat a very active cannery community built upon the harvest of Alaskan salmon. Now sits the skeleton of an abandoned, dead town. Its solitude is only interrupted by the cries of seabirds, the occasional animal wandering into the deserted streets, and the never-ending lap of waves along Port Chatham Bay. Now, it receives only a few visitors today, mostly in the form of adventuresome tourists and something else that may prowl the old derelict buildings. What could have caused this thriving community to just wither away and die? Well, if we look back, Portlock was founded in the early 20th century and enjoyed enough success to warrant the establishment of a post office there in 1921. Here, the population mostly comprised of indigenous Russian Aleuts canned fish for distribution across the continent. It had all the makings of a success story. Yet, within 30 years of its establishment, the Portlock post office would be closed, with too few residents to justify its operation. Something is fishy about Portlock's history, and I'm not talking about the salmon. The family of Melania Helen Keel was among those who packed their bags and left Portlock. They were some of the last to flee, and Melania, born in 1934, was just a child. Now, as it turns out, her family had feared for their very lives. "We left our houses and the school and started all new here," Melania said during a 2009 interview. "There was plentiful land here for gardening and people. My parents even built a house on the beach." This would have been sometime in the 1940s when evacuation of Portlock began in earnest. It was different for every family, but for most, the hysteria began sometime during the decade around the start of World War II. While so many Americans were joined in mortal combat overseas, the residents of Portlock, Alaska, apparently had their own battlefront to deal with. Something malevolent called the cannery town home, and whatever it was, folks, it was not human. Now, we get our clearest indication of what happened from the April 15th, 1973 edition of the Anchorage Daily News. The author of an article claimed that he had learned about the dangers of Portlock all while on a boat trip with a local school teacher and his wife. The teacher had grown up in Portlock and shared everything that he knew. Now, apparently, Portlock had shown promise in its early years. People came for the jobs, but were more than happy to establish their lives in this perfect, beautiful, picturesque village with its beautiful vistas of both mountains and the seaside. Now, by the early 1940s, however, rumors had begun to spread, rumors fueled by grisly discoveries. Something was amiss in Portlock. Workers at the cannery, eager to supplement their endless diet of fish with local game, would go off to hunt Dall sheep and bear in the hills of the Kenai Peninsula. Some would never return. Others would return afraid with horrific stories involving spirits in the forest. Still, others would return, sharing their stories not through words, but through wounds. Mutilated corpses of missing people began to wash up in Chatham Bay, swept down from the streams above. None of their wounds looked like any bear or wolf injuries that the old-timers had ever seen. Some seemed to have been ripped from limb to limb. Now, Brian Weed, co-founder of a group named Juneau's Hidden History, explained the facts surrounding these mysterious deaths in Portlock. He went on to say that those people did leave the town, referring to the people who departed. We know when the town and post office shut down. We know that there are reported murders in the area. Well, they called them murders, but they also included people that just went lost in those reports. Now, we're not talking about a dozen people. We're talking like 3 dozen people. If we had a serial killer in the area at the time, they took out a lot of people in the course of, say, 20 years. Now, alongside these casualties, circumstantial evidence began piling up. Trees were supposedly ripped, roots and all, straight out of the ground, only to be thrust top first back into the ground, the root balls facing the sky. Trackers on the trail of moose began discovering strange footprints in the soil. They looked like they had been made by human beings, but were far too large, sometimes in excess of 18 inches long. Now, oftentimes, these impressions would follow the moose tracks at a distance before closing in, terminating in areas where a struggle had obviously ensued. Now, from these locations of matted grass, only one set of footprints could ever be seen leaving the area. Those bare footprints of whatever had claimed the moose disappearing up the mountains and into the forest. According to the newspaper articles from 1973, this was just a taste of the horror that residents of Portlock had endured over the years, all at the hands of a beast known as Nantiinaq. Now, according to indigenous lore, the Nantiinaq stands around 8 feet tall, walks on 2 legs, and is covered in dark fur or hair. In short, the creature resembles my ex-girlfriend. Stories of large, hairy ape men found elsewhere in North America, collectively known as Bigfoot, but presents a decidedly supernatural flair not found in all modern Bigfoot sightings. Nantiinaq is blamed for everything from bad luck to even terminal illnesses. Unlike other hairy hominids, it seems to primarily come out in the fog. It also seems shockingly aggressive, much more eager to kill human beings than its brethren to the south. It accomplishes this with a set of razor-sharp claws on its hands, which are more than capable of separating flesh from bone. Now, the exodus from Portlock began sometime in the 1940s. Some moved out of town only temporarily, remaining elsewhere for a full year until the disappearances had subsided. Cannery employees even refused to show up to work one season, forcing the company to beg for their return. They promised that armed guards would be posted at the cannery 24/7, guaranteed for their safety. But none of this worked. By the 1950s, Portlock could rightfully be called a ghost town. Now, those who didn't leave of their own accord started to find it difficult to maintain a functioning community in the face of so much migration. According to some stories, things would get so bad around Portlock that village elders called for everyone to relocate to the nearby town of Nantiinaq. Now, legends surrounding Nantiinaq in the area apparently stretch back far earlier than Portlock's founding. In fact, Melania Keel's family had feared the Nantiinaq years before the hysteria of the 1940s. In fact, her godfather, Andrew Kamluck, had been assaulted while logging in 1931. Apparently, something had crept up behind him and struck him over the head with an incredibly heavy piece of log moving equipment, something no person could have moved on their own. The blow killed him instantly. Andrew's body was found 10 feet from the blood-spattered murder weapon, ruling out the possibility that he had simply fallen and hit in his head. It was incidents like this that led Melania Keel's family to leave Portlock for good, coupled with the murders of the 1940s. Now, around 10 years before Andrew's death, another man by the name of Albert Petka is said to have encountered a hairy giant in the woods around Portlock. Now, he successfully frightened the creature away, but not before it delivered a fatal wound to his chest. Albert supposedly survived just long enough to share his story with others. Now, even earlier, going back farther, cannery workers who lived in a camp 1 mile from the factory decided to abandon their jobs in 1905. Now, according to the letter that they left behind, they were forced to do so by a hairy man who wouldn't stop harassing them. Wait a minute, Russell Crowe was around in 1905? The refugees made a new life in Port Graham, just 9 miles north of Portlock as the crow flies. Simeon Kvasnikoff, an elder from Port Graham, remembered many stories blaming the Nantiinaq for various disappearances over the years. One was a gold miner who just simply vanished. Now, he said that this one guy over there had a little place where he was digging for gold, and he went up there one time and never came back. No one found any sign of him, he said. Now, Simeon also remembered a sawmill owner by the name of Tom Larson, one of the few people he knew who had seen a Nantiinaq and lived to tell the tale. Tom had been an indispensable member of the community, cutting wood to make the fish traps which cannery towns like Portlock heavily rely upon. Now, according to the story that he shared, Tom spotted the Nantiinaq on the beach once, and he immediately ran back home to fetch a firearm. When he returned, the beast was just where he had left it, and so he raised his rifle to take aim, but when he did, he said that the thing looked at him and he could not bring himself to pull the trigger. Now, was this a wise choice? According to one indigenous informant, one should never shoot a Nantiinaq. All you will do is make it angry. And she would say that you can shoot them, but you'll never kill them. One man tried to do it, but Nantiinaq just took the bullet and pulled it out of its chest. Yikes. Looks like we're dealing with Arnold Schwarzenegger here, folks.
You're fired.
Obviously, it doesn't seem like we're dealing with a flesh and blood ape here. This is only reinforced by the strange company Nantiinaq seems to keep. You see, it is not only something resembling Bigfoot that set residents of Portlock on edge. No. According to some, a second spirit was often seen around town, this one more human, but no less terrifying. Now, this particular specter resembled the ghost of a woman dressed in long, flowing clothes who would emerge from the cliffside at night without warning. Melania Keel said that this dress was so long that it would drag, and that the white face would disappear back into the cliffs, which this description does bring to mind countless female spirits seen throughout the world, including the Irish banshee. Although it should be noted, banshees were never described wearing the color black. However, the appearance of a female follower is actually quite common in Bigfoot stories, some of which have been featured here in the past. Now, every Bigfoot account invites skepticism, naturally so, and the events around Portlock are really no exception. One of the most common explanations is that people were simply misidentifying bears. Brian Weed entertained this possibility, saying this: maybe they were seeing an extremely large bear in the area. From a distance of, say, 100 feet, your brain has never seen a bear that big, so you put together an idea of what you think you saw. If the bear is standing up, say in the 10 to 12 foot range, it may be the biggest bear you've ever seen, and so your brain may not put together that that's a bear. Maybe you're seeing it from a strange angle, or it's too close to trees so you can't see its whole shape. Still, there are problems with this theory. You see, the population of Portlock, many of them indigenous, would very easily know a bear when they had seen one. I mean, come on. They had grown up with bears. Their grandparents' grandparents, and their grandparents' grandparents and grandparents' and grandparents' had all coexisted alongside Alaskan predators since the beginning of time. I mean, come on, guys. But some suggest that maybe Nantiinaq was a bear, but an especially strange specimen out of time. I mean, yeah, that is a theory. One of the most popular candidates is a surviving member of an extinct species known as Arctodus, or short-faced bear, a massive animal which could reach 10 feet when standing on its hind legs. Now, short-faced bears live in North America, or have said to at least until the last 12,000 years, and could have possibly survived undisturbed in a region as remote as Alaska. Now, in fact, a short-faced bear might have actually been killed on June 24, 1864, near Rendezvous Lake in Canada's Northwest Territories. The specimen came to the attention of scientists shortly thereafter when a group of Inuit hunters who had killed the beast passed the skin and skull of the massive bear into the possession of Roderick McFarlane. McFarlane in turn sent the discovery to the Smithsonian Institution, where the remains were studied by Clinton Hart Merriam. Merriam believed that the find constituted a new species dubbed Vetularctos inopinatus. Today, the specimen is known as McFarlane's bear, although debate has continued to rage concerning exactly what it represents. Some think that the skull and skin came from a polar bear grizzly bear hybrid, while the more skeptical think that it simply represents a juvenile brown bear, and not an especially large one at that. Now, even the idea of a surviving short-faced bear stealing picnic baskets in Portlock is too much for most skeptics to swallow. Instead, they propose that even simpler explanations, possibilities with varying degrees of usefulness. Now, first and foremost, the disappearances Portlock suffered in the 1940s may have indeed been the work of a serial killer, as Brian Weed previously suggested. If not homicides, then perhaps the missing people of Portlock can simply be tossed atop the heap of other tragic, mundane disappearances, the kind which us Americans still see today. Now, while other U.S. states report more disappearances, when adjusted for population, Alaska far outpaces elsewhere in the country. Now, as of 2022, Alaska reports nearly 42 missing people per 100,000 residents. The second closest state is Arizona, and it only reports between 12 and 13 missing people per 100,000 residents. Simply put, the Alaskan wilderness is dangerous country and was even more so dangerous during the Portlock's most tumultuous years in 1940. Again, this doesn't provide much in the way of an answer for why the town was abandoned. What is causing these disappearances? Well, what's more, as noted earlier, many of these bodies weren't disappearances. Well, they were deaths, and bodies eventually washing up once again. Now, this fact alone indicates that something was indeed killing these missing people, and if we set aside this inconvenient fact, what else could account for why so many people left Portlock between the 30s and the 50s? Some have offered other reasonings. The Kenai Peninsula, included in the area around Portlock, is rich in chromite. In fact, some of the earliest Nantiinaq tales from the 1920s seem to focus around the nearby chromium mining camp. Now, chromium has several practical applications. It can be used as a pigment. It is employed in the polishing of blades and the surfaces of optical devices. It is also finding its use in refractories due to its high melting point. Yet for all of its uses, the mining of chromite produces adverse health effects. It can also contaminate the environment, entering nearby water supplies where it will kill plant life. In mammals, this can create reproductive difficulties, stunt growth, shorten your lifespan, alter behavior, and even cause cancer. This is starting to sound like a pharmaceutical commercial listing the side effects. The chromite mining camp near Portlock began operations in the early 20th century, and so did residents flee to avoid the possible health effects? And even if they didn't explicitly know about the toxic side effects of mining, perhaps they simply noticed that they felt better elsewhere and decided to move. I mean, it would only take a few people leaving town before a critical mass was reached, encouraging others to follow simply because they didn't want to be the last people left in a dying village. Boom! Enter in 2021 and Sally Ash, a resident of Nantiinaq, where many of the Portlock residents fled to, and cousin to Melania Keel, who have mentioned previously, claimed that the reason the town died wasn't a mystery at all. She would say that people would see Nantiinaq, she said, but that wasn't the reason why people moved. They moved because of the economy, schools, and the church. There really was no killing of people. Now, the timing of this certainly rings true. Around the same time that people began leaving Portlock, construction finished on the extension of Alaska Highway Route 1. According to some, roads like this diverted traffic away from places like Portlock. Similar stories unfolded in the lower 48, where countless small towns along the famous Route 66 simply would just die away after the interstate system was opened, diverting much-needed tourism and travel spending away from local economies. Still, it is difficult to look at the Portlock narrative and not scratch your head. For instance, why has none of the infrastructure ever been recovered? The cannery operations was profitable, but when the town died, all the equipment was just simply left behind. Some of it being highly valuable, easily salvaged metals like iron. It is almost as if everyone who left was in too much of a hurry to gather their belongings. It's a little odd, isn't it? Now add to that the fact that people left Portlock and stayed away, and it remains a true mystery. Moreover, let's not overlook the obvious. Many people in the region simply accept Nantiinaq as a reality. I mean, the area has a very old, storied reputation as being haunted, if not by Nantiinaq, then by spirits in general. Some even claim that the story of Portlock had already unfolded long before the town itself was ever founded. As Brian Weed would say, for the locals that grew up in the area, this thing has apparently existed for hundreds of years. There was a small village site at Portlock before it was ever founded, and those people had originally moved away. Today, locals still remember the stories that they heard about Portlock and remain hesitant to ever venture into the area. Now, Sally Ash, mentioned a little earlier, told a reporter that Portlock was always kind of a creepy place, adding that they'd tell us don't go out on the foggy day. That's when Nantiinaq is walking around and you could run into him and you never know what he might do. Sally also shared a horrifying family story. He was tying off his skiff. He started smelling something really bad in the bushes, so he opened it, moving the branches. Something's going on here. Then he looked in there and there was a man with his hands in the back way turned around. It looked like a man, but he was all hairy and he looked really scary. So he and our cousin took off running and didn't want to be up there. He wasn't sure if it was a Bigfoot, but it was a horrible smell. Russell Crowe again, stinking up Portlock. Interestingly, Sally Ash went on to explain how some of the stories of her cousin Melania Keel had shared in 2009 were just tall tales. Now, despite this revelation, Sally is adamant that her brother's encounter is genuine. She also insists that not only is Nantiinaq real, but it can be indeed found around Portlock. It just apparently wasn't responsible for the evacuation of the town. Now, Sally Ash says that anyone who looks for Nantiinaq is bound to be disappointed. It only appears when it wants to. This is because, according to Sally, Nantiinaq is not flesh and blood, but is, in reality, a shapeshifter. If you follow him, he will hide, and he could turn into a different animal. You can chase him, and suddenly he vanishes behind a tree, and when you get close enough to see him, all you see is a shimmering little mouse. They would change to different animals, make you feel sad for them. They said don't touch them, just leave them alone. The story that Sally Ash shared from her brother highlights the fact that Nantiinaq stories continue to the present day. In fact, the Discovery Channel launched a series detailing events around Portlock in 2021 entitled Alaskan Killer Bigfoot. Like other reality television programming, the show is a mixture of quality research and sensationalism. The team of Alaskan Killer Bigfoot has collected Bigfoot evidence from around Portlock, supposedly encountering something resembling Nantiinaq, and even brought in a psychic to share spiritual impressions of the area. Other compelling tales have arisen in the modern era. One of the best came from a paramedic named Ed who was working in the Anchorage area in 1990. Now, on one call, Ed and his partner were called out to the jail in Eagle River to help a prisoner who had a heart attack. The two paramedics hopped in the ambulance and raced to help. Now, before long, they had the patient fully stabilized with IVs, oxygen, and medication. and Ed began the drive back to Alaska Native Medical Center, where the prisoner would receive further care. Now, the patient, an indigenous man in his 70s, began feeling well enough to engage in small talk along the way. Now, soon enough, Ed and his partner discovered that the patient was an avid hunter from Port Graham. Now, over the course of their conversation, Ed remarked that he himself had been to Dogfish Bay on the Kenai Peninsula, just 5 miles from Portlock. Now, according to Ed, when I said that I'd spent some time in Dogfish, this old man sat up on the gurney and grabbed me by the front of my shirt. He got right up in my face and said, "Did it bother you?" Well, with that question, the hair just stood up on the back of my head. I said, "Yes." "Did you see it?" was his next question. I said, "No." "Did you see it?" He said, "No, but my brother's seen it. It chased him." Ed knew that he and his patient were discussing the same thing, Nantiinaq. Although the patient didn't elaborate on his brother's sighting, Ed's story is worth sharing. In August of 1973, Ed and 2 others, maybe it was Ed, and Eddie, had been hunting for bear and goats when a storm had rolled in, forcing them to take shelter on the shores of the lagoon. The men beached their skiff and started making the best of things, putting together a dinner of broiled salmon before turning in for the night. Now, Ed's tent, which they all shared, was made of dark green canvas, but had no windows or vents to which they could see through. Although they would have welcomed them while hunting earlier that day, the men had no desire to attract any bears to their campsite overnight, and instead left their fire burning and thoroughly cleaned their pots and pans. Now, eventually, the storm cleared up that evening, but the wind remained thrashing the old growth timber along the shoreline, and Ed would explain what happened next. Sometime around 2 a.m, my friend Dennis woke me up by squeezing my leg. I could dimly see his face in the tent. His fingers were across his lips. I listened. Then I heard it. A step. A man was quietly walking outside our tent, taking very deliberate steps. This was not a bear. Scenes from the movie Deliverance flashed through my mind. We woke Joe, the 3rd member of our party, with the same leg grab and finger to the lips. The walking, or rather sneaking, continued until it half-circled our tent, and then all was quiet, except for the wind. We had our bows and the rifle leaning against a tree outside the tent, so somehow we talked Joe into belly crawling out of the tent to get the rifle. Ed said that he and his friends were in full-on panic mode, but none of them had seen anything. The following morning, rain had moved back in, and with the wind refusing to let up, they did a little hunting and saw some bears, but never got a good chance for a good shot. They claimed they didn't talk about what had happened last night, and claimed that they were too embarrassed to be scared by a black bear that sounded like a man. So they had apparently got back to camp early, built a large fire, sat around it, ate dinner until around midnight. Now, the August sun doesn't set along the Kenai Peninsula until like 10 or 11 at night, and with the extended daylight, the men felt very silly for being so frightened the night before. Still, they slept with the flashlight and rifle fully locked and loaded between them. Ed was glad that they had done so, and he would continue. I finally dozed off, but woke right up when Dennis squeezed my leg. The illuminated hands of my watch showed it was 2:30. Joe was already sitting up and had the rifle in hand. I heard the first step, not more than about 10 feet from the back of the tent, slowly. Then another and another. Whatever this was, it sounded like it was walking on 2 feet. It made the same semicircle around the tent. And when we finally got enough courage to crawl out of the tent and turn the flashlight on, we saw nothing. No tracks, nothing. The 3rd night, we decided if it bothered us again, we would come out of the tent shooting. We were actually scared. It never came back the 3rd night. And the following day, we had a break in the weather and got the heck out of Dodge. Stories like Ed's offer a refreshing antidote to skeptics who dismiss the idea that a Bigfoot chased off the residents of Portlock, Alaska. What I mean by this is, we can talk all we want to about misidentifying bears or about the dangers of chromite mining. We can talk all day about the tall tales that residents like Nantiinaq may or may not have made up, or how new highways, not a gigantic hairy monster, killed Portlock. At the end of the day, though, skeptical explanations fall into the same category as the accounts they wish to refute. They are stories, convenient truths we tell ourselves to explain the unexplainable. But try as we might, there are some things that just can't be dismissed, no matter how hard we try. It seems that a paramedic named Ed, like so many on the Kenai Peninsula before him, experienced something like that firsthand. And because you guys have made it this far into the episode, I want you to all comment down below, "There's something in Alaska," so I know who made it to the end of the video. And if you guys enjoyed today's content, be sure to go ahead and smack that like and subscribe button for more videos by yours truly. As always, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you guys in the very next episode.